I'm thrilled to open up this event and welcome our speakers. We're first going to be joined by Rosanna Shaw, the coastal environment reporter for the Los Angeles Times. She was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2020, and her reporting of the DDT dump site off the coast of Southern California has been featured in the Best American Science and Nature Writing Anthology. Her book that we're talking about today, California Against the Sea, is a beautifully written book that examines the future of our state's vanishing coastline in the face of sea level rise. And it was just awarded the Golden Poppy Award for Nonfiction, which recognizes the best books out of California. Rosanna will do a brief reading from her book, and then she'll lead a discussion with Laura Engeman, who is a coastal resilience specialist with the Center for Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation at Scripps and California Sea Grant. Laura works to apply scientific modeling, observations, and tools to guide climate change adaptation policies and investments. She's interested in methods for tracking climate change trends at a local scale and is developing and testing experimental adaptation strategies. She also served as the co-chair of the Science Policy Task Force, contributing to the most recent State of California Sea Level Rise report and guidance that was released last month. So thank you, Rosanna and Laura, for joining us today.
Wow, what a full house. Thank you all for coming tonight. And thank you, Lauren, for bringing us all together and to the Birch Aquarium. Lauren, I just want to say a few quick things, is such a bridge builder, and she has helped me make sense of so much of the incredible science that happens on this campus. And we just spent this afternoon with a lot of students and postdocs, and I have just been really inspired hearing everyone's questions and just all the different thoughtful approaches to all these different fields of science. So I'm coming into tonight just really recharged and energized by the amazing work that happens day in and day out on this campus. And it is really, really special to have Laura Engeman here with us today. She wears so many hats, is a master communicator of the science, and the team that she works with at Scripps and at Sea Grant has really led the way on how we, wrap our minds around this massive issue of sea level rise. And this book would not be possible without folks like, Mark Merrifield, Adam Young, and so many others here at campus who do the hard work of just helping me explain this issue to the public. And it is truly an honor to be here tonight with all of you. It is really weird for me to be the one up here speaking and not asking the questions to folks. Well, I will get to ask. I think we were thinking about how to structure this, and I was like, I think I'd like to ask the questions of Laura rather than the other way around. And it means a lot to have all of you here tonight. Thank you for choosing to spend your Monday evening thinking about this really challenging issue with us. So yeah, I'm really inspired and really grateful. So I'm supposed to start with a short reading, but Laura, do you have any opening thoughts or anything you'd like to share with folks before we dive in?
Sure. I'll just start with thanking Rosanna for coming down and hanging out with us in San Diego, not just tonight, but she has come down several times to campus. She has met with all of us in the fields and on campus. She is also just so intrigued and interested in the topic, and many times we do interact with the media and they're sort of broadly touching on climate change, but it's rare that we get a reporter who has done their homework and who really wants to dive a little bit deeper into a specific topic like sea level rise. And so I think it has been a journey for both of us and for the whole Scripps team with Rosanna to sort of think about the science that we're doing, how it relates to the broader public, and then really, really exciting to see her book get so much play and provoke so much great discussion across the state. So thank you, Rosanna, for being here, and it's a joy to be up. She makes it really easy. She makes my job much easier.
Well, you make my job possible, so thank you. So I'm really touched by that. Thank you. So I'm going to read from the beginning of chapter 1, which opens right with the amazing flood forecasting work that is happening at Scripps. And Laura is literally the first voice you hear in chapter 1. And I also just want to shout out Serge Dedina and the leadership at Imperial Beach for having the just proactive foresight to reach out to Scripps to team up with the scientists to bring the science to the community. So thank you for your leadership. And I know Paloma Aguirre is now taking on the continued hard work of just helping communities like Imperial Beach move into the future. So thank you for the heart and care that you bring to your community. Okay, so I'm going to read from chapter 1 for folks who have the book. It's page 11. Chapter 1, California Against the Sea. The water churned with a wild energy one winter morning in Imperial Beach, and the people living along Seacoast Drive had been forewarned. Sandbags stacked along driveways and sliding glass doors lined the quiet beachfront road. Boarded-up windows cast an even darker pre-dawn gloom. At 4 a.m., the neighborhood barely stirred, but those lying awake in bed could feel the deep rumble, then crash as the ocean unleashed wave after big wave. It was only a few weeks into the year 2019, and the sea, burdened by melting ice in a human-altered world, was already hinting at what will become routine. A supermoon was hours away from aligning with the sun and the earth, locking in step a fierce gravitational pull that creates higher-than-high tides. Just offshore, a network of buoy sensors had alerted UC San Diego's Scripps Institution of Oceanography that on top of all this, the surf was also sinking up to be exceptionally large. 3 scientists, shouldering a drone and other wave monitoring equipment, hastened on foot toward a 3-story condo to reckon with what this confluence was wrecking. They had parked farther away, anticipating that the road, on a thin spit of land barely separating ocean from marsh, would be inundated by midday. Puddles were already pooling 1 block away, and the air, dampened by blasts of sea spray, made them wonder just how forcefully the waves were breaking. They scrambled upstairs to the balcony to get a better view. "Whoa, whoa, whoa, it's already happening," Laura Engeman said. The beach was submerged, the sea already rushing over the seawall and spilling onto Seacoast Drive. She had thought they would have at least an hour to set up that morning, but the flood had arrived long before the highest point of the tide. Across the street, the marsh was swelling over the cordgrass as salt water rose from all sides. Ocean and wetland were reaching for each other, remembering a time when the California coast was not hemmed in by pavement, a time when the water could still be won. Engeman, a program manager at Scripps who specializes in getting communities to think about climate adaptation, had been tracking what she called combined risk events in this big surf town. Paying attention to the waves, the tide, the floods that keep recurring, she said, could help more people understand what the ocean has in store. And now here she was with her colleagues, the clock already ticking, surrounded by this turbulent laboratory churning with new data. Right before their eyes was a window into the many pressures looming over the rest of California. Another low boom from the ocean quaked and thundered. Her team stood by in momentary shock. There had been quite a bit of flooding here just a month earlier, signs of an already astonishing winter. But these waves right now, these swells, were much bigger than anything they had seen all season. I feel like the applause should go to Laura. That was the opening to chapter 1 that it sets up the Resilient Futures Project at Imperial Beach. You will meet more of the researchers and learn more about the science in the rest of chapter 1 and also chapter 11 of the book. But immediately my hope with this opening passage was to help set up that we have even less time than we think, because sea level rise so often feels like a more abstract, longer term issue than wildfires or drought or some of the other more dominant climate change conversations in the state. So, Laura, I think, you have helped my own understanding of sea level rise in so many ways. And I think to start, I'd love to have you just reflect a little bit and share with the audience, why or how is sea level rise such a complicated issue to communicate to the public? I know we've riffed on this so much, but what are some of the challenges that you've run into over the years, as a scientist when trying to communicate the issue, whether it's the actual facts, the reality, or even the urgency? But what are some of the challenges that you run into? Because you do a lot of the public-facing work for your team.
The focus of my work is really on the science communication and the science translation. So I like to live in that bridge between the researchers, who many of them are here today, and the community members. What's the practical, tangible information that they need to be able to make decisions, to understand their risks, and how they can move forward in a productive way. And with sea level rise, it is often a challenge to have that conversation. One, as you mentioned, the focus has, for the past decade, been a lot on what we're going to see 100 years from now in terms of sea level rise, what's going to be underwater. And all of that is important because in the sense that sea level rise is directly tied to global warming and our emissions. And so there is a risk that we are going to have a significant portion of our coast underwater. There's also a need to take action to prevent those really far sort of reaching extremes of sea level rise. And I think part of that conversation that's also a challenge is that we can change that path. There is going to be some sea level rise no matter what because of the emissions and the warming path that we're already on, that we're already committed to. But there is still a pathway. There's still a future that is uncertain, that is very directly dependent on us as people and what we as our global community are going to do about climate change. So I'll reiterate that sometimes doesn't always, that connection between our climate change future and sea level rise being something that is just a definitive thing that we're going to experience. Yes, there is some of that, but there is also things that we can do. So that's part of the challenging conversation, is that sometimes you really have to open that door and say, there is still a door and there is still a pathway for us to choose, and let's do it together. The other piece about sea level rise that is challenging is that it's not a linear process. So meaning that change doesn't happen in a consistent rate. So far in California, we've actually been quite fortunate. Other parts of the country, other parts of the world may have seen sea level rise impacts in a more dramatic way than we have here in California. However, that sort of slow increasing rate is going to accelerate. And so we have this kind of slow burn. And then we have this what I call the hockey stick jump and inflection. And so it's tough to talk to people about when is that going to start to happen, and how much time do we have to prepare? And that leads to kind of the third aspect that I think is challenging, which is that there is a lot of our tangible physical experience with sea level rise is actually going to come in the form of increased flooding and increased sort of chewing away and erosion of our coasts, and losing the ability for us to recover and respond to those events is where we are going to feel sea level rise first, probably more so than where things are going to be underwater. We're going to experience when a road is becoming flooded and harder to maintain, and that road closure happens before it's underwater, but we now no longer have access to that road. We no longer have access to that beach parking lot. We have lost increasing amount of staircases. We have lost, and I live in the town of San Clemente. We have lost the railroad line service several times this year. So I want to reiterate that is where the communication aspect, I think, has some room to evolve, because the experience of sea level rise is going to be sort of this slow burn, as I mentioned, and then all of a sudden, ouch, that starts to hurt in my wallet. Ouch, that actually starts to hurt in terms of my ability to be able to access and do things. I can't go to my beach anymore because there's very few times in the year where there's a beach left. So these are the experiences of sea level rise that I hope to communicate, and I think part of the conversation that needs to happen, and also very much a part of what I think Rosanna has done really well in her book, if you haven't read yet, is really talk about these impacts in terms of every community is going to have a little bit of a different response to sea level rise, both the physical aspect of the flooding and erosion, whether they have cliffs that erode or whether they have more flooding, they're going to lose more roads. But every community also has what's important to them. What's important culturally that they're going to lose, whether it's access to surfing rights, or whether it's like a campground that is like one of their favorite places and brings the city a lot of income, or whether it's a railroad line. And these are really important aspects to the story that Rosanna mentioned, because as we decide what we're going to do about sea level rise, that sort of value proposition that we bring to the coast is part of the conversation about how we understand what our risks are and how we're going to transition and adapt as a community together.
I have so many questions, and you're about to witness what our conversations usually are like, because my mind is going a mile a minute. So I think a couple touch points I would just want to index on. I think one thing that I have found effective in climate communication, this is something I tell journalism students all the time, is like recognizing whether a story is about mitigation versus adaptation. And those are two very wonky words, but I think sea level rise is truly, in so many ways, the questions that we must face is how we respond to it. And kind of like, how do we slow it down and how do we mitigate it? But largely, I think the reason why the issue is challenging is because we're being forced to respond to the consequences of sea level rise and making sacrifices that are politically challenging and also just not something that calls for sacrifice and changes in our lived ways of life, right? And that doesn't negate the fact that we do need to mitigate, but I think sea level rise is largely an adaptation conversation. And I do feel like California talks a great game about mitigation and net zero emissions and trying to slow down the impacts of global warming. But then when we conflate the two, and it so often does in the general conversation, we think, oh, California is doing great on climate change, but then you separate the two and you're like, we've got a lot of work to do on adaptation. I think I'm going to jump around on one of our questions. I want to touch on what you were saying about how the way we think about the projections and the numbers and how we present risk and how we think about sea level rise. So when I first started writing about sea level rise, it was a lot of end of century projections. By 2100, we can expect the sea to rise this much in a high end scenario, this much in a middle of the road scenario, and this much during, like with a business as usual. Actually, my hands should be here and versus here. And then I feel like in the last couple of years we shifted, or at least the state from a policy standpoint started to shift to, okay, let's think about what we need to prepare our infrastructure and our communities by 2050. So I felt like the conversation shifted to, let's make sure we prepare communities for 3.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050 as a precaution for all of the things that we're starting to already start to see. And I feel like in the last couple of years, it has shifted to this notion of frequency. Like, do we actually have to wait for the line to move this much inland on a static 2D flood map for us to start responding? Do we actually have to wait for 3.5 feet of sea level rise to start responding? Or is 3.5 feet of sea level rise a king tide plus a high swell plus an El Nino year, plus a flooded river that has also swelled up kind of some of the capacity for our existing system, like our wetland systems and our soil to absorb the excess water? At what point, like you said, is something essentially underwater if it already starts to flood more and more frequently, but not fully underwater? So could you talk a little bit about how, talk a little bit further about how this notion of frequency and helping people document change is helpful in shifting the message from something so abstract and far off into the end of century versus bringing it closer to home?
Sure. She's leaving the door open for me to talk about the Scripps research team, which is great, and Imperial Beach. So this idea of how it floods, how often it floods, why, and what are the drivers of flooding, and how that varies by community to community and sometimes street to street. So Imperial Beach was actually the test bed for the Scripps research team that is based in oceanography. So they're tying essentially what happens in the ocean with waves and tides and that water when it hits the shoreline. And they have been, Mark Merrifield and the Coastal Processes Group have been studying this for many decades and have a wealth of resources with understanding essentially what drives coastal hazards. What are these sort of extreme coastal storm events? Sometimes they come during El Ninos. Sometimes they come during a southern hurricane event that we've seen. Sometimes they're driven by high tides during a king tide season that cause us to have higher water levels and that spillover. Sometimes it's even groundwater that's coming from the ground up that's causing flooding. So there's a lot of different reasons that we experience flooding. Sea level rise amplifies all of those. So we know that sea level rise will increase flooding, but each of those have different levels of sort of chance or risk to happen. And then with sea level rise, some of those, their probabilities go up even more than others. So this is called total water level in the science world, which basically means that you're stacking all of these things together. And when they all coincide, when it's a high tide like we saw in January, when it's a high tide, when there's larger waves, when the sea levels are already elevated because of warmer oceans, and all of this comes in at once, this is when we see the largest impact to our coast. We care about this because this shows us these extremes are a certain baseline today, right? That type of event is, we qualify it as maybe a 20-year storm or a 100-year storm. As we move into the future, those 100-year storms are going to happen every 20 years. And so we have to start thinking about the frequency of events happening, and then we also have to tie that to the more that our sea levels are elevated, the more chance that it only takes that much more elevation for the water to get up and over our existing infrastructure, or to reach further ends of the beaches, or to wash out our dunes. And so this is really what the research team at the Coastal Processes Group is really focused on, is evaluating what happens during these extremes, measuring these baselines, and then figuring out what those thresholds are and how they're going to change into the future. So applying statistics to that, and really starting to build what we call a flood forecast system. So knowing what those different drivers are and what are the triggers that are going to potentially cause that water to go up and over and or erode the coast at a different, and that's what was built for Imperial Beach. And it provides a 3 to 5 day window that gives an advance notice. And using the city's photos and documentation, they were also able to sketch out thresholds so that we know, like, there's a line that when it crosses, that's going to be a mild event, or it's potentially a more moderate significant event. And that alert goes out to the city to indicate, hey, this is kind of the type of preparedness that you might want to take as that comes. So then this, thank you. I'll just want to thank the drone footage from Rob Gresnabach, who's here as well. Beautiful footage that we've played many times and was out there capturing a lot of this, including the LiDAR data, helping set up the LiDAR data. So all of this is now being replicated up and down the state. So Mark Merrifield's team, along with with state parks, are now building these flood forecast systems for multiple locations up and down California, and hope to expand it for many other communities in California to help prepare. So there's a lot that we can learn from these events, but also there's a lot that we can learn from even the mild to moderate events, because that's, as I mentioned before, that's starting to change what our shoreline looks like. And every time we lose a little bit of shoreline, we need to know, is it going to come back? Sometimes that sand comes back, or is it potentially permanently gone and we have a new baseline? And that new baseline means that we have more vulnerability and more exposure. So we have to sort of monitor all that, and the monitoring capabilities here at Scripps are really top of the line, quite advanced, and our ability to sort of track change. This is becoming a demand from almost all the communities across California. We need to track change because we need to know when we're starting to reach these critical thresholds, and we might have this pot of money that we're going to invest, but we want to sort of see when's that risk get to that certain point where we really need to start putting a lot more money into not just protecting, but maybe even moving, relocating, transitioning some of our infrastructure away. So these are critical questions for decision making, critical questions about risk, and it all relates back to that sort of flood frequency and intensity and duration of these type of events and how they're changing.
Yeah, and I think the forecasting work is so cool, and the chapter 1 that I just read from, and also the video that you just saw, was in January of 2019. It was the first major time that the team really nailed the forecast. It was the king tide was supposed to be on a Saturday, but the highest point of the tide actually came a day earlier, and you were able to issue alerts to the city. They were able to get sandbags, and kind of, I think what really struck me from a storytelling perspective and from someone who's tried to communicate this issue and learn about the evolution, I've witnessed kind of the evolution of how we've been providing data to the public, I was really struck by not only like our ability to forecast and to help communities prepare for flooding, to recognize that this is happening more and more often. I thought the amount of work, it was like an incredible amount of work by, you know, the whole team on also piecing together the historical record, right? And helping me realize how many data gaps we had, and also how, you know, it's so important to document change, to notice, understand the frequency, the increasing frequency going into the future. But also something I think someone said, and you know, maybe Serge can verify this too, but like I feel like when you first started the project, someone told me like the city didn't keep track of every time the waves topped the seawall, right? We didn't really know. The city would just clean up the roads when it flooded, so that by the time people woke up, the status quo was already in existence. And I think that from a communicating standpoint, it's just fascinating to me how we have the amount of work we've put in to try to maintain this baseline for normal that keeps changing, and how our inability to also recognize change day to day is kind of adding to this sense of not delusion, but our ability to not think about the issue. So the work that your team has done, you know, going back through like historic, like social media posts and historical records and articles to find out where the flooding hotspots were in the past, how often, trying to put together this frequency, like, you know, retroactively, this timeline. And then since your team started tracking it, it's been really cool to see consistently, like, wow, like the seawall does get overtopped a lot. It does increase during these periods, and recognizing the compounding influences too, so that we can model and forecast not in a silo with just like, you know, when the line moves here, this happens. And I think that dynamicness of the modeling and the forecasting and also the data gathering has been really remarkable. Sorry, that was not a question. That was just a comment on how amazing the work is.
I will just add, I will just add that's very much a partnership effort too between Scripps and the city of Imperial Beach. You know, they are a small and mighty team in Imperial Beach, and they are a pleasure to work with in terms of city staff. And so, you know, one, we're providing the forecast, but there's a lot of work to be done in terms of making sure that forecast is working properly. And so they take the time to give us feedback. Yes, it looked like it was more of a mild event. No, you know, yes, it was more of a significant event. We saw flooding on these 3 seas. Mark is generally great at finding some great student volunteers that want to run down to Imperial Beach and take photos, but it oftentimes those king tides and stuff do happen over the holidays, super inconveniently during Thanksgiving and Christmas break. And so either Mark's driving down by himself to take the photos, or we're relying on the city staff to sort of report back and send us some photos of what happened. And so it is this give and take constantly of trying to make sure that you know, what we're doing is refining the capabilities and the advancement, but as you mentioned, it also is heavily reliant on having a community partner like that who can provide us with feedback on, you know, what's happening in the community, you know, how streets were flooded, if it looked different from something before, how much, you know, some of this also depends on like the beach changes. So during that big January event, Adam Young put up his LiDAR for the first time to really monitor how much the beach loss was happening during that storm event. And I think it was up to like 3 feet of a drop during several hours. So that all that type of information really helps us understand the dynamics that are moving constantly over the hour, over the half hour, over days. And so we still also rely on the city for some input on kind of what's happening in the beaches, in addition to, you know, being able to provide the sort of fancy imagery that we can collect. So it is a partnership, I will say.
I'm so glad you brought up Adam Young, because every time I talk to Adam and learn about his science and the like things that he's doing and the technology that he's using, I'm like, we can do what now? You can do what now? So could you talk a little bit about the technology specifically, and like the kind of data that we now have access to, or that, you know, that wasn't as present or front of mind or possible like 5, 10, 15 years ago? Like, do you feel like the like fundamental ways of collecting data has shifted or evolved in a way that has really advanced the way we can think about this issue on shorter and midterm timescales? Like,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are definitely grateful at Scripps to have the ability to have fairly advanced technology. So LiDAR is essentially laser scan imagery. Adam and his team have been using this to monitor beaches and change in beaches. So now, it used to be on a truck. Many of you might have seen the truck with the Scripps logo. It's got the little LiDAR on top. It's scanning the beach. And oftentimes, in particular the last few years, it's been scanning the cliffs. So anytime you've seen the local news, the sort of cliff failures that are happening, generally the LiDAR is out there trying to capture essentially what happened. It gives us this really high resolution 3D imagery that allows us to see what's happening, not just in a 2D elevation ways, but also sort of what's happening in terms of slope and 3D change of the coastline, which is really important for flooding and erosion. And then a few years ago, there was an advancement on putting that LiDAR up onto drones. So we were able to, the Scripps team was able to reach a lot of beaches that were inaccessible by the truck or inaccessible by foot. And so that imagery now with the fancy drones, we can get offshore like you saw in Rob's imagery and really monitor for a bigger swath and also see sort of that where the water and the shoreline, what's happening with that dynamic, which has always been the really challenging part of the nearshore oceanography science. Is like what actually happens when the sort of waves reach the beach, how does the beach change and all of that. So all of those pieces, the imagery is a lot more high resolution. There's now a number of Scripps students and researchers also playing with satellite data now as another form of higher resolution imagery to look at shoreline change, especially in areas that are harder for us to get to. In addition to that, like you mentioned, there's a whole bunch of, we are really good at taking pictures now. Everybody can take pictures. So there's even ways that community, there's a program, CoSnap, that some folks at Scripps are trying to figure out if we can use that data. So there are little poles where people put their camera and take pictures and then send them in. And those show us beach change over time. And they can be knitted together into videos and also looked at with data, coincidentally, to see change. So there's, between that and then the huge amount of data processing capabilities and model runs that we can do now, we can run a whole bunch of different scenarios, like we were mentioning. Like we don't quite know what's going to happen. We have a lot of dynamics at play, and so the ability to punch in all those dynamics and sort of run the probability of all those is a huge advancement in data processing. And I guess the last thing I'll just say is that all of those models that we talk about, what the future of sea level rise is, how the beach is going to change, all of those depend on having a certain length of data set, especially to see climate trends, because El Niños only happen maybe every 10 years. We need to see these ups and downs like we all have seen in the weather. We have extremes. We're a Mediterranean climate, so we need a longer record to be able to see what sort of our historic extremes have been during these like either rainier or stormier seasons, as well as our sort of calm seasons, to get a sense of what the real baseline is for climate change and sea level rise. And so we're fortunate that we have a number of sites, and one of the longer data sets here at Scripps that modelers around the world come and use that data set to essentially test how well their model works. So our beach data here, thanks Bob Guza and others for decades of data, provide a real value not just here locally, but also across the world.
Yeah, so we have like so much more capability to, gather the data in more nuanced and site-specific ways, and also in big data processing kind of ways. We are now asking sharper questions on frequency and thinking more deeply about how to shift the way we help people think about timescales and risk, in the long term versus the shorter term and the midterm. And, we're getting to the point where we're able to forecast and alert people of flooding today that is happening and helping them react tangibly to risk today, and, in a way that is also helping, hopefully, communities think more broadly about how their day-to-day lives are changing in increasing frequency. And I guess to go beyond that, so the science is getting really, really good. Not that it was bad before, but it's getting really, really good. But how do you navigate kind of the scientific aspects of this conversation, with the social aspects of the conversation and ultimately the political aspects of this issue, right? And so and I think this is a loaded question because I kind of feel like I know the answer, but can you talk about the science without talking about the social aspects and the political aspects? Or is part of the challenge of communicating sea level rise and any climate change issue really because of the fact that you can't talk about science without the context in which it sits in? I guess I feel like you've kind of been in a lot of these spaces where you are trying to bring the science into the community, bring the science into the policy, but how do you navigate these worlds once you leave the world of just science? And I know that's a really hard question, but I know you've reflected a lot on this and have obviously are a practitioner in this.
Yeah, I guess I'll say that the challenge in sea level rise communication now and going forward is that there is teaching people how to navigate what science to use when is there is a lot of data. There are a lot of models. There are a lot of visualizations. And like you said, the huge benefit is that we've been able to downscale things to a very regional and local level. So we can tell communities at much more specificity of what's happening at this beach and what some of its hazards and what its vulnerabilities and exposure are to sea level rise versus this bigger regional scan. The whole Southern California is likely to see this much, 3 feet of sea level rise. We can get a lot more specific, and you need that type of specific. If you're going to design and you're going to spend millions of dollars elevating a bridge or moving a road or even moving a lifeguard station is probably going to cost a lot more than you think it's going to in terms of adapting or accommodating sea level rise. And so you need to make those decisions with that level of sort of detail, but you also are going to want some certainty. And that's where it gets tough because we only have so much certainty. Where we've evolved in the science is that we now pretty much know what global warming and emission pathway we're on to 2050 and maybe a little bit beyond. That has translated into much more certainty about what sea level rise is going to look like between now and 2050. So that's great. We kind of know we have this sort of around 1 foot that we have to work with. And like I mentioned, there's all this great information now on there's going to be a jump in flood frequency. We also have pretty good projections on that. So that is helpful. That is a helpful piece of science for decision makers and coastal communities and leaders, because a 30-year time frame is people's mortgage. That's a time frame we can all chew on and understand. Then you start to go to 50 and 75 years. There's a little bit more uncertainty, but as I mentioned, there's also this kind of capability of understanding what types of events and sort of types of extremes that we might start to see. And that gets at the heart of what is our risk tolerance. And that's where the social political context is really important for us to have as communities, because risk tolerance can vary broadly person to person, right? I might be perfectly fine if that road floods or if I can't use it because it's not that important to me. It might be really important for the lifeguards because that's where they run their junior lifeguard training or something that is a big, part of their, or a stormwater system might be capable of functioning for a while. So it, stormwater managers are like, okay, that's great. But then after 2050, it's likely that pump is going to fail. And then I'm in big trouble. I need $1 million investment for my stormwater system. I can afford $100,000 for, I can afford these small little pumps and do this intermediate thing. So it's starting to lay the groundwork for these more serious investments. And that's where we do have science capabilities for this critical time period right now. And the nice part is that we also have in the models and this new statistical probability capability with all this data processing that we have, that we can essentially start to run these pathways, and that is moving a lot of our communities towards what's called adaptation pathway planning, which essentially is designed on science metrics. So it sort of allows us to make those risk tolerance decisions. So it might say, okay, we are comfortable if our beach gets this narrow, but if it gets past this point, we as a community want to act. So we need to work with the scientists because we need to know when the beach gets to that width. We're comfortable if that road overtops 5 times a year, but if it reaches 10, we as a community, that's our critical threshold. So these thresholds have to be something that the scientists and the researchers can actually provide data to support, and then the communities have to be ready to use that, to take that science information and actually make a transition to a pathway that's either more intense or more aggressive because it's moving faster. So these are ways for us to design further out into the future without full certainty, but saying, okay, well, we're going to design one strategy for if we get to 5 feet in this much flooding, which is a more extreme scenario, but we want to make sure we're kind of prepared and we have a strategy if we end up there. But we're also going to do the more likely one here, and then we're going to monitor it, and every 4 years we're going to kind of check and see where we're at, or every year we're going to check and see where we're at. And these are tangible ways that we can start to build this communication, build these partnerships between the observations that scientists are doing and the real world sort of decisions that need to be made. And that's, like I said, that's not, there is a lot of science out there, so I think the challenge is figuring out how to package some of that up in a way that is transferable to communities and decision makers, but also it's a two-way street. Those cities and communities also need to sort of talk about what their values are and how we can link it to the science observations so that we can support them on that.
Yeah, I love that. And what you said about pathways and also decisions, I think is reminding me too that one of the biggest disconnects that I see in communities, and also when I talk to folks who are like just really wrestling with the politics of it and the emotional backlash and the anger of communities when they're being told like this is what the numbers say and this is what you have to do, is this misconception that responding to sea level rise is this massive one-time action that a community has to do, whether it's this massive vote on whether or not to put manage retreat in a planning document or not, whether or not to do like pay X amount of money for this thing. But truly responding to sea level rise is an ongoing process, a process of visioning for a community, a process of deciding and conversing as a community what it is that you actually value and want for the future. Because I think most folks know on some kind of gut level that something's going to change, 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now, but there's also this recognition that nothing has to be done tomorrow, right? So how do you help people shift from that short term into the long term and kind of navigate this really kind of tense middle period, right? That's where we're stuck. We kind of have recognized that the long term will require change, but none of it technically needs to happen now. And to an earlier point, I think I don't run into as much like climate denialists in California anymore. It's time. The denial and the debate in California is how much time we have. And ultimately it is like, how do we shift this notion of going from thinking we have to make one big action versus really engaging in this ongoing process of change. And I think another thing that I've been reflecting a lot on from a more philosophical level is like, what is the difference between change and loss? Because so much of, I think, the emotional elements of this conversation has been people really wrestling with what it is that we're going to lose in order to respond to sea level rise, in order to adapt to sea level rise. But does change actually have to be loss? And can we reframe this conversation about what it is that we're afraid of losing into what it is that we can gain as a community if we do look at the numbers, think through what it is that we value and what it is that we want, many decades from now? And I remember someone else telling me too, she was A.R. Siders at the University of Delaware. She was like, it's kind of like, adaptation is kind of like telling people to eat their broccoli now so that they won't get a heart attack 50 years from now. But no one wants to eat broccoli. They just want to drink tequila. So like, and so I think I often think about that. Like, how do we bridge the short term with the long term, and how do we navigate that transition period? Because I think what's interesting too is that, the number of scientists and engineers I've talked to who are like, we can't science our way out of this problem, because there is so many social elements and like an emotional element that is really hard to navigate and really fraught once you bring the science often into the community. Some of it is how we communicate it, but I've also kind of recognized too that it's not just how we package it, it's truly acknowledging what the community is afraid of. Like, I've been thinking a lot, Naomi Klein, who her most recent book was on conspiracy theories, and I heard her on a podcast recently, and she said something that stuck with me. She said that conspiracy theorists get the facts wrong, but the emotions right. And I think it's so important to validate how someone is feeling, even if why they're feeling that way might not be grounded in the right facts, but kind of acknowledging why someone is afraid of what's going to happen to their property value, or why some discussion here or whatever about sea level rise is going to impact something. And I think that, this fear and this uncertainty and, like, again, our anxiety about change and kind of almost conflating it with loss has been some of the thematic through lines that I've been sensing in the conversations that have been happening up and down the coast. Sorry, I just got a little philosophical, but I guess it's crazy how fast time just went. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then maybe we can take some questions from the audience after. But I think another theme that really emerged for me as I was writing this book and figuring out how to tell this broader story of the California coast and our relationship to the ocean, what it means for the future, is this notion of resilience and what it actually means to be resilient. I mean, for anyone in the room who has worked in climate change or coastal adaptation, that word comes up so often, right? It's become so wonky. My editor at the LA Times still says, like, I don't know what that word actually means. Like, I don't use some other word. So, but it's interesting, like, what makes a community resilient? What makes infrastructure resilient to sea level rise? And I'd love to hear you reflect on that. And then maybe if there's time, I'd love to read a passage from the book that I literally started asking every single person I was interviewing, what does resilience mean? Because if I'm talking to someone who lives in a frontline community, who has, who lives in a place that is overburdened with our legacy of industrialization because of our legacy with redlining certain communities, she would tell me resilience is the fact that our community is still thriving and alive and still living despite the fact that all our kids get asthma by the time they're in 4th grade, and that we, that is what resilience means to us. Versus I talked to Colston Engineering, he's got very different notions of resilience versus, our traditional sense of resilience is like this ability to remain unchanged. And again, change and loss are such core questions, I think, for me, but like Katrina levels New Orleans, and we shall rebuild exactly what we lost and exactly where we lost it. That for so long was our notion of resilience. But long-winded setup to, now I'm going to ask Laura a question that I've asked everyone. What does resilience mean to you? What does it mean to have a resilient community in the face of sea level rise?
It's a tough one. Like you said, it is a term used often and frequently, but it's not well defined in a lot of ways. So I think, I hear things like build back better. I guess I push against that because, again, I think that it's a notion that we're just rebuilding what we did before and maybe just bigger and fancier, and not necessarily, accepting the fact that maybe it's moving or adapting or relocating or even thinking about our systematic change. So we talk a lot about roads flooding and sea level rise. In my mind, if we're thinking 100 years out and where we're going to be in terms of sea level rise, I really hope that we have figured out fuel efficiency and transportation and emissions a lot more, and we have advanced, so maybe we actually don't need as many roads and highways as we have today. So I kind of always think about also, we like to think that we're thinking about climate change impacts, whether it's sea level rise or other things, and we think that everything else is staying static. And we have to remember that we as humans also are evolving, and our systems are evolving, and our communities are evolving. So in my mind, when I think about resilience, I think that we kind of have hit, a period in our sort of human history where we got really sort of comfortable and we thought we could sort of we thought we could sort of build our way or engineer our way or solve our way out of all these sort of, natural earth processes and like weather systems and stuff. And now we're kind of facing this like, oh, everything is an extreme weather event. Well, we live in a natural system. We humans are part of a bigger natural system. And I think we kind of have to remind, our sense of resilience is that we need to reevaluate natural processes and learn to support those natural systems and processes in the way that they need to function. I mean, we have finally figured out maybe we shouldn't build so many levees and we shouldn't try and control our rivers because it doesn't actually work that well. And so we have to start thinking about our natural systems and how they are going to work themselves out a little bit more if we give them a little bit more space. We've constrained everything in terms of our sort of hydrologic oceanographic processes. We've tried to make our estuaries go out in their outlet in their tiny little area. If we can adapt and we can learn to transition and evolve these spaces on the coast, I think that they will still hold that true cultural connection for us and hold that really important space that when you talk to people about the ocean and the coast, they almost always come back with an answer. What does it mean to you? Almost come back with something very heartfelt. It's not, I love the building or whatever is there. It's it's a very personal connection to it. And I think that we can maintain that, but we have to be open and we have to be adaptable and we have to learn that not everything is going to stay exactly as it is. So for me, resilience is really this ability to think in a way that's transitioning and, as you mentioned, ever evolving and being sort of more adept at accepting some of that and accepting some risk and accepting that we as sort of humans need to sort of rethink how we enjoy the coast, how we use the coast, how we build on the coast. And we have a real opportunity for that. We have a lot of public spaces in California. We have a lot of areas that are being retired in terms of energy systems and road systems. These are real opportunities for us to sort of try again, I guess, if you will. So to me, that's resilience. And that's where I hope our communities will get in terms of this revisioning process.
That's really beautiful. And you're reminding me too, actually, one of the things that, the main misperception that I run into, and I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but the number of people who still think of the coast as a static place blows my mind. The coast itself is a process, right? It's this constant tension between land and ocean, and there's this whole intertidal zone, but there are people who truly believe that every time they go to the beach, it's supposed to look exactly the same as it was before, even though if you stand on the beach and look at the tide line, every time the wave crashes ashore, that line in the sand is different. But then you turn around, you look at Pacific Coast Highway, the rail line, all the ways we've tried to fix this line in the sand and impose permanence onto an inherently impermanent place is at the heart of so much of this tension. And like you said, resilience is possibly rethinking and resetting the way we relate to this constant this dynamic zone of change, right? Okay, so we have a couple questions. Rosanna, after going to all the places you've gone while writing your book and touring after writing your book, what do people seem to care about the most? Property, access, resources, or something else? Ooh, I really like that question. I get the what can I do question a lot, but I do think property is something that I run into a lot, this notion of holding on to property value. And I think that, again, honoring the emotion behind that too, right? And the passage I was going to read is just kind of, resilience to me is truly thinking about whether or not the status quo and maintaining the status quo, is actually what we want, and because to refuse to change is actually accepting the fact that the world as it is today is as good as it gets. And I think that no one would necessarily agree with that in this room. And I think, what we were just talking about, the coast is this ever-shifting line in the sand, and yet what is at the core of so many of these issues? We're trying to hold on to property lines, we're trying to hold on to city boundaries and all these, seeming to the ocean, seemingly arbitrary lines that we have created within these systems. So for me, ultimately, like resilience and responding to sea level rise is an opportunity to rethink and re-examine and reconsider some of these systems, political, social, and economic, that have gotten us into this situation in the first place. But in terms of like, so yeah, like I do get that in the course of my reporting, I would say the point of tension and what people care about and what they're trying to hold on to is property lines and property value. I think access and resources and, you know, our relationship to the coast, I think the broader kind of notion that the beach itself is a public space. It's something that is supposed to benefit everyone. And, you know, in California, the beach does belong to everyone. I think, like you said, like every person I talk to on all sides of the issue have a stories of how they connect the first time they saw the ocean, why they chose to live on the coast, or why they choose to go visit the coast, and why they feel a connection to it. And I feel like this book, in many ways, is this like sponge of everyone's love for the coast. And I feel like the number of folks who've said, I really feel the love and care and deep, like, yeah, love in this book surprised me, but I also realized it's because it's all of your love that I have absorbed from every single conversation. And I think that more than anything, I was really surprised by the amount of commonality that people had in everyone that I talked to. You know, even someone in town, I was just in another, I was doing a community talk in a community where the issue was pretty fraught, but like folks will say like, oh, don't talk to this person, he's really angry and blah, 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 blah. And then I talk to him, and like there is, again, like getting past the anger and the emotion, like people all care. Like that I think is so important to remember, and that we all have more in common than different when it comes to this issue. Next question, what role does K-12 education have in sea level rise communication? Do you have thoughts on that? I'll just say that one of my best friends is a 4-year-old just FaceTimed me and showed me the lesson he had on beach erosion and how he just like washed water over a cup of sand. It was really, really cool. But I think there's a lot of hope that I have when I talk to younger generations about not just sea level rise, but in understanding beach erosion and kind of helping more students connect with the ocean earlier. And, you know, I think there's a lot of great work happening on bringing inland students who live further inland to recognize the watersheds that they live around, even if it's like the concrete LA River, and recognizing how all these systems are interconnected. But more than anything, like I've been so moved by how younger generations have this renewed sense of like the commons, and how ownership to land is almost different. I run into less, I mean, part of it is probably because housing costs so much these days, but this idea of owning property and being like, this land is my land and it will be my land forever, like that notion has really been less present in the younger I go when I talk to folks. And I think you know, to the question on like K-12 education, I think this like reconnection to the commons and the sense of belonging to a broader collective has been really powerful in the folks who are now in like high school and college and just out of college, and the way they are now stepping into these bigger roles on guiding this conversation going forward. And I'd be curious to see how that translates in K-12. But do you have other thoughts on like what to do in K-12 education?
I think we're running out of time. I will say I'm working on a project where we're trying to expand K through 12 sea level rise materials and content. So if you have ideas, or we're just starting that project, so come talk to me. I'd love to hear your ideas about it. I think there is a deficit of sea level rise content for K through 12, so especially here in California. So I hope to expand that. And beyond that, I think we're running up against the clock, but.
Sorry, I could have talked forever with Laura, but thank you all for being here tonight. As you all know, it's really hard to contain it to one conversation, because climate change is related to everything. And I think that we all have a role to help deepen these conversations. And I think often, I've been thinking a lot in the last few months since my book came out, that, you know, Katherine Hayhoe once said that one of the most important things you can do about climate change, like to fight climate change, one of the most important things to do is to talk about it more often with your neighbors, with your family, and just really get these conversations going. And my hope with this book was to start a conversation and deepen conversations in communities where it's already starting to happen. I'm just grateful for all of you for continuing the conversation, you know, long after we all leave this room. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosanna.